Today on Your Government in Action, where we cover bills, votes, records, and how it affects you. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act is the largest investment in America's roads, bridges, and broadband since Eisenhower built the interstate highway system in 1956. America's roads are crumbling, its bridges are aging, and roughly 100 million Americans cannot get reliable internet at home. For decades, those problems got worse while Washington argued. Then something unusual happened. Republicans and Democrats agreed. On November 15, 2021, President Biden signed the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act into law. $1.2 trillion. The largest dedicated infrastructure investment since the interstate highway system was built in 1956. This is the story of what that law says, how it passed, and what it means for your daily life. Let's start with what the law actually does, and where the money goes. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act is also called the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. The total price tag is $1.2 trillion. Of that, $550 billion is brand new spending on top of what the government was already planning to spend. So where does it go? Start with roads and bridges. $110 billion is directed there. That sounds like a lot, and it is because the need is enormous. About 45,000 bridges across the United States are currently rated structurally deficient. That means inspectors have found problems serious enough to flag. You may have driven over one of them this week. Next is broadband internet. $65 billion goes toward expanding high-speed internet access, especially in rural and low-income areas. Right now, about 100 million Americans cannot get reliable broadband at home. No broadband means no remote work, no telehealth appointments, no competitive education for kids. The law treats internet access like electricity, something every household should have. Then there is rail. $66 billion goes to passenger and freight rail. That is the largest federal rail investment in American history. Amtrak gets funded for the first time in decades at a scale that could actually make a difference. Water infrastructure gets $55 billion. That covers replacing lead pipes, upgrading treatment plants, and fixing systems that are literally poisoning communities. About 10 million homes in the United States still receive water through lead pipes. Lead causes permanent neurological damage in children. This funding is specifically aimed at ending that. Public transit gets $39 billion. Clean energy and power grid upgrades get $73 billion. Ports and waterways get $17 billion. Airports get $25 billion. And there is $7.5 billion specifically for electric vehicle charging stations, building a national network so EV drivers are not stranded between cities. Now, knowing what is in the bill, let's talk about how it actually got passed, because that story is just as important. Getting a bill this big through Congress is never simple. This one started with President Biden making infrastructure a centerpiece of his agenda in early 2021. But the first version, called the American Jobs Plan, came in at $2.3 trillion and included things that went well beyond traditional infrastructure, things like home care workers and research and development spending. Republicans pushed back hard. They said that was not real infrastructure, and that is where the negotiations got interesting. A group of senators, 5 Republicans and 5 Democrats, decided to see if they could find common ground. They became known informally as the Gang of 10. The 2 senators most often credited with driving the deal were Rob Portman, a Republican from Ohio, and Kyrsten Sinema, a Democrat from Arizona. They spent months negotiating in conference rooms, cutting things out, refocusing the bill on what both sides could agree was traditional infrastructure: roads, bridges, rail, broadband, water. The result was a bill that was smaller than Biden originally wanted, but one that had genuine bipartisan support. The bill passed the Senate in August of 2021. Then it sat in the House for months. House progressives wanted to link it to a larger social spending package. House moderates refused. The standoff lasted into the fall. Eventually, the 2 sides struck a deal to vote on both separately. On November 5, 2021, the House passed the infrastructure bill. 10 days later, Biden signed it on the South Lawn of the White House. Members of Congress from both parties stood behind him. It was one of the only times in recent memory that a major piece of legislation brought Republicans and Democrats to the same stage for the same signing ceremony. That does not happen by accident. It happens when both sides genuinely believe they got something out of the deal. The deal got done, but not every member of Congress was on board. Let's look at exactly how the votes broke down. In the Senate, the vote was 69 to 30. That is a wide margin. You need 60 votes to break a filibuster, and this bill cleared that bar with 9 votes to spare. On the yes side, all 50 Democrats voted for it, and 19 Republicans crossed the aisle to vote yes as well. That is a meaningful number. In today's Senate, getting 19 members of the opposing party to vote with you on a signature piece of legislation is genuinely rare. On the no side, 30 senators voted against it. All 30 were Republicans. Their objections ranged from the cost to concerns about how it was being paid for, to arguments that it set a precedent for even larger government spending down the road. In the House, the vote was closer. 228 in favor, 206 against. That is a much thinner margin. 13 Republicans voted yes, which gave the bill enough cushion to pass even though 6 Democrats voted no. Those 6 Democratic no votes came from progressives who wanted a commitment on the larger social spending package before supporting the infrastructure bill on its own. The final tally reflected the political reality. This was a genuinely bipartisan bill in the Senate. It was a narrower, more contested vote in the House, but it passed, and that matters because major infrastructure legislation had failed to advance in Congress for years before this. Multiple presidents called for it. It became a running joke in Washington. Infrastructure Week became a punchline. This time it was not a punchline. This time it became law. So Congress passed it, the president signed it. But what has actually happened since then? When a law this large passes, the money does not appear overnight. It flows through federal agencies to states, to local governments, and then to actual construction projects. That process takes time. But the spending did begin. Within the first 2 years of the law, the federal government announced thousands of individual projects across all 50 states, bridge repair projects, broadband expansion grants, rail upgrades, water system replacements. Some of the most visible early action came in rail. Amtrak announced new routes and corridor upgrades. States that had never had reliable passenger rail started receiving federal grants to study and build out new lines. On broadband, the National Telecommunications and Information Administration began distributing grants to states to build out networks in unserved and underserved areas. Every state submitted a broadband plan. The effort to connect 100 million Americans without reliable internet access officially got underway. On lead pipe replacement, the Environmental Protection Agency began coordinating with water utilities to identify and replace lead service lines. Communities in places like Newark, New Jersey and Benton Harbor, Michigan, that had already faced water crises, saw federal funding arrive directly. On roads and bridges, the Federal Highway Administration began processing state project applications. Bridge replacement projects that had sat in limbo for years waiting for funding started moving forward. The interstate highway system itself was built over roughly 15 years after President Eisenhower signed the Federal Aid Highway Act in 1956. That system created 41,000 miles of roads and transformed how Americans live, work, and travel. This law is not that scale, but it is the most serious attempt in decades to repair and modernize what Eisenhower built. All of that is national and historical context. But what does this law actually mean for you specifically? Start with your commute. If you drive, you have probably hit a pothole or crossed a bridge that felt a little too old. The $110 billion for roads and bridges is aimed directly at that. Your state receives a share based on need and formula. Over time, that money shows up as repaved roads, repaired overpasses, and replaced bridges. The difference is not immediate. Construction takes years. But the pipeline of funded projects is now real in a way it was not before. If you live in a rural area or a lower-income neighborhood, the broadband piece may matter most. The $65 billion is specifically designed to reach places that private internet companies have not served because it was not profitable enough. If you have been doing work calls over a cell signal or driving to the library for internet access, This funding is aimed at changing that for your community. If you have kids in school, broadband at home is not optional anymore. Remote learning, homework, college applications. Connectivity is a baseline now. If you drink tap water, the $55 billion for water infrastructure is about protecting your health. Lead exposure has no safe level for children. The goal is to replace every lead service line in the country. That is a massive undertaking, but the funding is there in a way it never was before. If you take public transit, $39 billion goes toward upgrading buses, trains, and stations. If you care about clean energy, $73 billion goes to modernizing the power grid and supporting the shift away from fossil fuels. And if you are planning a long road trip in an electric vehicle, $7.5 billion is building out the national charging network that makes that possible without anxiety about finding a charge. This law will not fix everything. Infrastructure investment of this scale takes a decade or more to fully feel. But the funding is committed. The projects are being assigned. And for the first time in a long time, the work is actually happening. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act is $1.2 trillion aimed at the roads you drive, the water you drink, the internet you use, and the bridges you cross every day. It passed with Republican and Democratic votes. It is the biggest infrastructure commitment this country has made in 65 years. Whether it delivers on that promise depends on execution over the next decade. We will keep tracking it. If you want to know how your representatives voted on this bill, check the links in the description. And subscribe to Your Government in Action for more breakdowns like this.